Winnipeg has the largest urban Indigenous population in Canada. 93,000 First Nations, Métis and Inuit live here. I spoke with Chief Danny Smyth earlier this week. Chief Smyth, thanks so much for joining us. So just to kind of set the stage for our national audience watching this, they may not have this background information. I mean, you started off as a young constable in the 80s. You were one of the last people to see J.J. Harper alive. You were one of the police officers who was doing life support. Can you tell it? And then, so your entire career from that point on, and then through the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. I mean, that's your entire career. How did that shape your career as a police officer?
Well, I think, whenever you're involved in a critical incident like that, it certainly, it has an impact. And my experience and exposure to Indigenous culture is even before that. When I was in university, I lived for a whole summer on the Long Plain, and ran a youth drop-in center. So I had a lot of exposure to the Anishinaabe and some of the different Indigenous cultures in our province. So it was an easier transition when I came on the job, and it's kind of just gone from there.
There's a lot of criticism. This past year has not been easy, I would imagine, for police officers. 2020, 2021, and through, really what got this conversation going had nothing to do with anything happening in Canada. It was, the George Floyd murder, and then all eyes are suddenly on all police officers. Talk of systemic racism in policing, Indigenous Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter movements stem from that. You've been on the record in local media saying, this has had an impact on police morale. Can you walk us through, how's it been for the past year?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of layers that are impacting morale for us. Like everyone, our members are dealing with the fallout of the pandemic as well, and that's certainly a level of stress that they encounter in the field every day. But with the way that the messages around George Floyd and some of the news out of the States, it's a constant, a lot of criticism directed at police throughout the world, and Canada included. So, the internet and media can make the world seem pretty small sometimes, but, there's a little bit of perspective here. We're not the same as the United States just by sheer volume. But, that's not to say we don't have our problems here. We certainly do, and we're doing our best to deal with them.
To people who say, systemic racism is built into police forces, what's your response to that?
Well, I've always acknowledged that we want to be careful that we don't have barriers that would prevent people from either joining the police or barriers when we're dealing with the citizens that we serve. So, there's a number of things that we do to ensure that we don't get caught in those pitfalls. Just having police standards is a good way to start that. We're one of the few police services in Canada, that's an accredited service, and we have been for more than 25 years. So just ensuring that we get audited and that we comply with standards goes a long way to demonstrating to people that we're adhering to best practice.
There's in this past year, there's a couple police shootings here in Winnipeg. Lots of criticism directed towards the Winnipeg Police Service, saying Indigenous people are not safe. How do you, as a police chief, how do you kind of navigate through those waters? And what's the response? What do you say to the public who truly believes it's dangerous to be an Indigenous person in Winnipeg?
So again, perspective is important. I mean, we get inundated with news often coming out of the United States. They have 1,000 police fatal shootings a year in the United States. By contrast, we have maybe 35, 36 in Canada a year. And of that, generally we have maybe one or two that occur here locally. Last year was a higher number. We had 4 shootings last year, but perspective is important. I mean, it's about 0.3% of the time that we're involved in any kind of use of force, let alone use of lethal force. So I think it's important to have perspective, and also think it's important to have relationships in the community. You know, I speak regularly with leaders in the community and with many of the service providers, the NGOs in the community that do a lot of service work with the Indigenous community. Those relationships are important so that they see a different perspective as well.
I know, Damon Johnson, the president of the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg, he sits on the Police Services Board. He sings your praises, certainly, as a police chief here. Can you give us a little bit more? You've got people like that supporting you, supporting Winnipeg Police Service, and on the flip side, you've got a lot of the movements building, being critical. How do you kind of expand into more partnerships, I guess, while there's still those conversations? Are you finding that Indigenous organizations kind of want to take a hands off, I don't want to get into it, I don't want to be seen to be friends with the police? Is that happening?
No, that hasn't been our experience at all. I'll give you a couple of examples. I testified at the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry a few years back, and I was on a panel with Diane Redsky. There's someone with that we have a regular working relationship with when it comes to dealing with the counter-exploitation and Indigenous women and girls being exploited in our city. We work routinely with Diane and Mamawi to combat that. We work routinely with groups like the Bear Clad. So, we've provided them with training, we've provided them with equipment. We've provided them with funding, a pathway to funding. So, these groups aren't running away from us. I think that's the answer, is to really partner where we can and increase those partnerships to provide service in the community. And Diane and I spoke at the inquiry. That was the model. It's police supporting the Indigenous-led services that are here in the community.
And did that come as a in the wake of the Tina Fontaine case, right? Lots of criticism, but police didn't take it seriously enough when she was missing. Is that this relationship with Diane Redsky, lovely, wonderful woman, love the work that she does? Was that the takeaway from the Tina Fontaine matter?
Well, I would go much beyond that. We've been working with Diane and many of the outreach networks here in the community for the better part of a dozen years now. So that's been a slow change, but it's been a real solid partnership, and it's one that we'll continue to maintain and thrive on.
I want to ask you about the Defund police movement. There's lots of conversations being had. People demand a change to the types of calls that police would respond to. Particularly mental health, wellness checks, those sort of things. Your thoughts and sort of the thoughts of the rank and file. When you hear that call to change how policing is done, what's the response within the police? What's being said?
Well, a couple of things there. Depending on the circumstances of a call, I think that it makes sense to partner with social workers or crisis workers. You're seeing that in many cities. I know you spoke with Edmonton. They're probably further ahead than a lot of other cities in Canada in doing that. I think there's merit to that approach. Having said that, sometimes these situations are pretty volatile and pretty dangerous. So it makes sense to have a police presence at times too. A couple weeks ago, we have community crisis stabilization units here in the city, and someone had gotten up on the roof and were threatening to jump off the roof. Well, the people at the crisis stabilization unit actually called the police to help them with that one. So there are times when the police are a necessary part of that. I guess the other thing that I find, I don't think it's fair to approach this as a zero-sum game where it's like take from the police and give to a community group or to healthcare or addictions. If you look at the way the funding is set up now, there's a lot of funding in the system. Just looking in Manitoba, over $6 billion a year annually for healthcare, over $3 billion a year for education, over $2 billion a year for family services. And you contrast that with policing, we're talking about $300 million a year for policing in the city. So, there's a lot of funding in there. I think the path for us is partnership.
And what do you think is going forward is the most important thing for the Winnipeg Police Service to do in mending those fences, I guess, of the people who are saying, they're a danger to the Indigenous people. I know you'd said the partnerships, but kind of if you could dial it down or boil it down a little more, like, is there one kind of specific one that's on the go that's going to make a big difference?
Well, it's sometimes hard to defend against that kind of narrative or rhetoric. Sometimes you see an awful lot of it on social media. So I don't want to get into a war on social media with someone I'm never going to convince. But for me, it's the leadership in the Indigenous community, the Grand Chiefs, the president of the Métis. I have really good relationships. We each have each other's phone number. We talk fairly routinely. A lot of relationships in the community. I talked about Mamawee, Ganaganich, Sage House, they're Bear Clan. There's a number of NGOs in the community. I think we have a relationship. We need to maintain that relationship and just keep on going, being open about it.
Well, certainly the Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand is a big fan of you guys. It had a giant full-page ad in Winnipeg media here singing your praises. So it sounds like you guys have made the connections to have those partnerships and with those leaders. We thank you for taking the time to join us today to share this with us, because as we said, there's no sense in having conversations about defunding police and Indigenous lives and Black Lives Matter if we're not having these conversations too with police.
Well, I think relationships are the key. You can't get to know a person if you don't spend time with them. President Chartrand took a lot of heat for what he did there, but that relationship was in the making years ago, and they're just listening to what the Métis say and the troubles that they've gone through, and we've built a relationship along the way, and he supported us when he saw us taking a hard time.
Chief Smyth, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.